we know what we feel is by registering sensations in our body. So that
Mm-hmm.
if I feel like kind of something around my eyes and a pressure in my chest and something at the back of my throat, I don't have to say, oh, those things equal sadness. I know I'm feeling sad. But I think if
Yeah.
you're living in a virtual world up in your head, you don't have access to your feelings. I'm thinking
Yeah.
of one client in particular, very dissociated, had a major trauma in her past. And, in almost every session, I would stop her from talking and just say, okay, breathe, move your attention down into your body, into your chest. And she'd start crying
Mm-hmm.
almost every session. And yet the rest of the time she was unaware of it. So I do
Yeah.
think that there's this cohort of kids, but let's talk about the boys who are living in virtual worlds who may already be kind of on the spectrum a little bit, which
Mm-hmm.
is has similar features, detached from their bodies, more cerebral, unable to process emotion, not not tuned into social cueing. And I think when you don't have access to your own bodily experience, it makes you very vulnerable to narratives about who you are. They can
Yeah.
just tell you who you are, like donning a different avatar for, an online game you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
Heather Hang says something very interesting along these lines in her last book with Brett on Weinstein. She sort of hints at it, and I really agree with her that something's happened in the last, I guess, 15 years with the technological advances and with the growth of social media where kids are they're just dissociated from their actual in-body experience.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us again. Today we have Joe Burgo, and he's going to talk to us about some pretty interesting things. So I'll let you go ahead and make your own introduction so that I don't butcher it terribly because I feel like I never do anybody justice.
um, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing for more than 40 years. I'm also a psychoanalyst, which means I went through an additional 4 years of training and spent a lot of years on the couch myself. Um, I've had a general practice for all that time. I've been in private practice almost all that time. I've worked a lot with personality disorders. I have a special interest in shame and how it drives narcissism. And when I got into the gender space several years ago, I brought all that with me to my understanding of what's driving trans identification, and it's what I write about today.
Wow, that's really interesting. I haven't heard of that perspective of shame and narcissism before necessarily, but you did touch on that in your Gen Spect presentation titled The Boys Who Don't Masturbate, I think is what it was called. A lot of people were
Right.
up in arms about that title.
Well,
But
I think in retrospect that was a little clickbaity, that title, and
yeah, I was
I
just
could
about
have
to
chosen a
say, I
better
think it was,
title.
but
Uh,
it was direct. I mean, it was the focus
right,
of these boys and the reason why they don't engage in that. And that's kind of an integral part of maturing as a male and going through
right,
puberty and things like that is that aspect. I think for people to pearl clutch and act like that's not something that is part of a healthy male development
right.
um, are doing a little bit of a disservice to
I
men.
agree. The issues of shame and narcissism, I also discussed them with Sasha and Stella when I was on their
Mm-hmm.
podcast. And just a plug, I also have written two different books on those two subjects. They're obviously
Oh, wow.
interrelated. In 2015, I had a book come out called The Narcissist You Know. And
Mm-hmm.
in 2018, I had a book come out called Shame. And they're they're related concepts. I see shame, unconscious shame, as being the primary driver of narcissism. And
Mm-hmm.
I define a particular type of shame, core shame, as a feeling of defect or deformity, the kind of felt awareness that something went badly wrong in your development. And for some people, it's so unbearable that the primary defense against that painful experience is to create a new false identity, an idealized false self, which is then felt to be superior to other people and is often defended against any kind of challenge or question in pretty obnoxious, hostile, destructive ways, which bears on the current subject.
Yeah. I think people can just relate to that on a really normal level. Like, we see that all the time in high school.
Right.
You, like, oh, I was so nerdy in middle school, so I have to reinvent myself in high school, be a new me. And eventually most people just kind of fall back into who they are. But there is that group of people that maintains that kind of super hostile, super obnoxious, arrogant type of person where they would never want to be associated with that person that they were before or their friend group from before. So I think people can relate to that. We see it in popular culture all the time. So,
we do, and I think we also see it in trans identification now. I mean, what I just talked about with Sasha and Stella is trans identification as a kind of a narcissistic defense against feelings of shame. And, we know these kids are often kind of misfits or outsiders. They've never felt like they belong. And then they get to create this new and improved identity, which wins them praise and acceptance. And then they become very vigilant about defending it and the truth of it. And they can become activists for gender ideology and become really destructive and hostile towards people who challenge it.
Yeah, they definitely can. Unfortunately, I've got a relative who is a young man. He's turning 20 soon, and he's dealing with some identity issues. And thankfully, we managed to steer him away from medicalization and trying to do that whole victimhood and gender dysphoria type of mindset, but he's still very much seeming to deal with some identity issues and latching on to labels and things like that. But it doesn't seem quite as bad as it was before, so that's a little comforting. He's still very prickly about it, though.
It's not off. That's not the usual story these days.
Yeah. Thankfully, I've got my background with gender dysphoria to try and relate, and also trauma and things that I can relate to relatives and things like that talk to me about it. So I've helped a few younger girls and things, but this was the first boy that I had talked to about it. So now that he's coming around being 20, it's a little bit more challenging because he's out on his own, and you can't really, he's doing that thing where he's like, I just want to be me and figure it out for myself, and I don't need any help. And it's a little bit of a challenge, but still trying to reach him and see what we can do.
That's fine as long as he doesn't listen to all the people out there in the world who are going to tell him who he is.
Yeah, exactly. That's the big issue with that personally.
Yeah.
But so you're going to be writing a new piece that everyone's going to basically fling arrows at you for, apparently.
Right. It's called Sympathy for the Devil.
Okay.
Autogynephilia as Psychic Retreat.
Okay.
And it grew out of my work, and I don't exactly know how this happened, but I've worked with about a half dozen men who struggle with autogynephilia in my practice. And I've been really lucky to be able to do kind of the psychodynamic work I've always done. And these guys trusted me enough to let me in and for us to explore together what's going on. So it's real. I found it really goes along with my thinking about shame and narcissism. That's part of it. There's a lot of trauma in these
Yeah.
guys' backgrounds, a lot of failed
Yeah.
attachment relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I can make a pretty convincing case for why TRAs are the way they are.
Mm-hmm.
Really kind of thinking about them in keeping with my narcissism book is kind of vindictive narcissists who
Mm-hmm.
try to destroy you for challenging their idealized view of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly J. Keene will understand what I mean. But then I felt that it really didn't go far enough. And as I began learning more about these guys and reading more, I think there's an additional element, which is that it's kind of a self-soothing mechanism. If you look at some of the literature, I spent a lot of time on Ask AGP subreddit, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of talk about cross-dressing as kind of relaxation, self-soothing, a way to deal with hurt feelings, a way to withdraw from reality, the challenges of reality. So it is kind of like a psychic retreat. It's a term the psychoanalyst John Steiner coined, where when reality is felt to be too much to deal with, you can withdraw into a part of your mind to escape from it. I think that's also going on with these guys. I've got some interesting clinical material. I've got some research from Ask AGP and a lot of other resources. I mean, I'm trying to make a comprehensive argument about what's going on.
So I've been thinking about this just in my own research of gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, and all of the comorbidities. Do you think it's like, now that you're saying this, it's making me think of this question. So I'm like, I need to think of how to phrase it well. Do you think, because some people argue that AGP is this innate thing that exists in a vacuum and comes out on its own. Do you think that, or do you think it's kind of a symptom of other disorders and other traumas and things that is manifesting this way?
My experience tells me that it's not simply innate and unrelated to other mental health issues, so I disagree with that. But my particular understanding is based on a much smaller group than, say, Mike Bailey has experience with. So
Right.
I don't know. All I can talk about is the kind of knowledge and understanding I've developed. I think people talk a lot about the relationship between AGP and personality disorders. And I think that's true, but not in the way people might mean that. I'm not big on diagnostic labels and disease categories to describe mental health issues. So I've written about it before, that I think that it's really shame and narcissism that can help us to understand the cluster B personality disorders. So I do see a lot of overlap between NPD and borderline personality disorder and autogynephiles, but not because they're diagnostic categories that overlap, but because they've got the similar underlying dynamics, unconscious dynamics going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at case studies and things that Mike Bailey has posted, and it has alarmed me from time to time, like certain things that he seems to overlook, and he hasn't really addressed it with me before when I brought it up to him. Like one case in particular I've talked about before that really, really stood out to me was a little boy who was 6 who was presenting with autogynephilia, which I don't know that it's a good idea to label a child with a paraphilia, but he was talking about how, oh, this is amazing because it suggests that it's something he inherited from his father, who's an autogynephile. And I'm like, oh, bingo, like that's not tipping you off that might be a confounding variable. And then there was another confounding variable that there was suggestions of potential like sexual abuse from the mother. But then the clinicians in the paper said something about how, well, the parents said there was no sexual abuse on their part to the child.
Right.
So, then clearly there was no sexual abuse. And it's like, like,
Yeah. Right.
like,
I just
so,
heard
yeah.
him talking about that case. I was listening to his appearance on Heterodorks with Corinna and Nina,
Nina.
and he talked about this as kind of some evidence and support of the idea that it could be genetic. I don't know. There's other possible explanations.
Yeah. So, yeah, it seems like there's certainly confounding variables that he's overlooking to fit his narrative. And I think that's a dangerous way to go. Like, we should be looking at every possible variable that's contributing to this if we really want to understand. But,
well, and I absolutely agree that you shouldn't be diagnosing a 6-year-old child with a paraphilia. I think that's a big mistake, and it's like what a cross to bear for the rest of your development.
Yeah. So some people have used the term, I think Stella might have as well, used the term autogynephilic child, or autogynephilic boys, and suggested, I don't know if she suggested in particular diagnosing a boy or labeling a boy with autogynephilia that you have in your practice. But I mean, I've heard from some clinicians that that's something that you would never, ever do. You never want to apply a sexuality or a paraphilia or anything to a child because they're in flux and things like that. So can you talk about that, like your opinions on that?
Yeah. I mean, I understand that Stella is saying that based on her experience, and I won't argue with that. But as a as a professional standard, I think it's incorrect to apply that kind of sexuality to a child. I don't think it's accurate or fair. What I will say is that I've worked with some teenage boys where I see similar dynamics with some of the older autogynephilic men, and I could see that maybe they're evolving towards that, especially if they're under the influence of sissy porn or forced feminization videos. But I think it's unfair to foreclose somebody's identity by diagnosing it at an early age. That just doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
I don't, in general, I don't like diagnostic labels. I think we can't avoid autogynephilia. There's just kind of no way around it because it's a constellation of features that go together, and it seems to be a distinct entity that we can talk about. But other than that, I just don't like diagnosis or diagnostic labels. They make us feel like we understand something when we don't.
Yeah. I also feel like there's this push now too where I feel like it's irresponsible and it goes against the messaging of, dress however you want and things like that. Don't stereotype boys, don't stereotype girls. When we say if a boy is presenting feminine or having any kind of gender distress or anything like that, when we say, oh, well, it's either because he's gay or he's AGP, and those are the only two options,
right.
We're kind of, at that point, it's like, well, why don't you just say that they were meant to be trans? Like, it's the same kind of just, you've, as you said, closed the book, you've put them down two paths and there's nothing else.
Right.
And I've tried to argue this with certain people, and then they'll say, no, you just don't understand. And it's definitely one or the other. It's super rare that it's anything else. And it's like, well, it just doesn't feel right to me.
No, and I get the same kind of pushback, probably from the very same people that are pushing back on you. There is this kind of strict adherence to the Blanchardian typology, that they're either HSTS, homosexual, transsexuals, or they're autogynephiles. Well, I'm working on another paper. I'm working with a group of parents that are parents of ROGD boys, and from my own practice and experience to talk about a third way, which I
Mm-hmm.
see. Um, and I don't know that I'm able to say much with certainty yet. I've got more work to do. But what I see is what looks to me like a socially and technologically induced kind of dissociation, where kids
Right.
today, and this goes from both for both boys and girls, spend so much time in virtual worlds and in screens that they've lost touch with their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, we all do this. Those of us who are feeling people do this automatically without having to know that we're doing it. But the way that we know what we feel is by registering sensations in our body. So that
Mm-hmm.
if I feel like kind of something around my eyes and a pressure in my chest and something at the back of my throat, I don't have to say, oh, those things equal sadness. I know I'm feeling sad. But I think if
Yeah.
you're living in a virtual world up in your head, you don't have access to your feelings. I'm thinking
Yeah.
of one client in particular, very dissociated, had a major trauma in her past. And, in almost every session, I would stop her from talking and just say, okay, breathe, move your attention down into your body, into your chest. And she'd start crying
Mm-hmm.
almost every session. And yet the rest of the time she was unaware of it. So I do
Yeah.
think that there's this cohort of kids, but let's talk about the boys who are living in virtual worlds, who may already be kind of on the spectrum a little bit, which
Mm-hmm.
is has similar features, detached from their bodies, more cerebral, unable to process emotion, not not tuned into social cueing. And I think when you don't have access to your own bodily experience, it makes you very vulnerable to narratives about who you are. They can
Yeah.
just tell you who you are, like donning a different avatar for, an online game you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
Heather Hang says something very interesting along these lines in her last book with Brett on Weinstein. She sort of hints at it, and I really agree with her that something's happened in the last, I guess, 15 years with the technological advances and with the growth of social media, where kids are they're just dissociated from their actual in-body experience.
Yeah. It's interesting that you should say that because I did kind of unconventional therapy for my body dysmorphia and the gender dysphoria. And one of those unconventional means of therapy was hypnotherapy. And it was a lot of the breathing and reconnecting and like sensing my body and what I was feeling in it. And I did cry a lot, like as soon as we would start doing that.
Right,
And I didn't realize how much tension I was carrying around all the time.
right.
And I helped my brother. He used to have really crippling anxiety. And I did the same like hypnosis techniques and everything with him and had him listen to the recordings that my hypnotherapist had done for me. And I mean, it was like revolutionary for him. He's
Right.
so much better now. And he can just self soothe now so easily and just get it together. It's crazy. Like
Yeah,
how effective that is, just reconnecting with your body.
it's
It's,
huge.
yeah, yeah. We've lost that definitely these days,
You
and
know,
it's so important for boys in particular because so much of their energy is that kinetic physical energy.
right. I mean, one of the things that I think pretty much every therapist I know who works with gender distressed kids will tell the parents is get them off of their screens, get them out doing physical activities using their bodies. Everybody knows they have to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one
I
of
would
the
hope so.
ways I think about it is, um, defense mechanisms, the ways that we hide unpleasant truths from ourselves. Um, in a way, all that means is really shifting your attention away from something. Like, I'm not going to pay attention to that painful thing over there. I will
Yeah.
pay attention to this instead. It's not something that we consciously decide to do. It's a kind of an unconscious defense mechanism. But when you think about it, I'm gonna move out of my body where I register all of this pain and trauma, and I'm just going to live in my head, in the realm of
Mm-hmm.
words and symbols moving around that have nothing to do with what's going on down below.
Right.
That seems sort of kind of intuitively obvious to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, I mean, part of that is the shame. It's like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't
Right,
want to acknowledge that it happened to me. I don't want to, there's that guilt that comes with it that
right,
I was complicit to a degree in my own abuse,
right,
or in a negative experience that I had. And it's really difficult to contend with. And a lot of times what I tell people is like, well, what would you tell somebody else that had those feelings? You would be forgiving, right? And
right,
that's what my therapist told me. And so that's what I tell other people. And then it's like that moment that clicks, and it's like you don't want to be forgiving to yourself because you're still so ashamed and you feel so guilty.
right.
And that's really, I think, where the power abusers have over you is that continuing to make you feel bad.
Right.
And like that's where that hole is. And it's like, no, like they're the broken person that still needs to work out their stuff. You're fine. You need to just like heal and be okay and accept and forgive and everything. So sorry for going off on a
No,
tangent.
that's okay. I just add to that as I would say, yes, but they've also damaged you, and you've got
Mm,
some feelings about the way you're damaged as a result of what happened, and that's hard to bear. You'd
yeah.
rather not go near that either. I'm not sure it's
Mm-hmm.
just a matter of forgiving yourself, which needs to happen, but
Mm-hmm.
also sort of accepting the ways in which your experience damages you in lasting ways. That's really hard
Yeah.
to face. Not that you can't grow and recover from them, but it's not just a matter of forgiveness, I guess.
Yeah. It does definitely like change you forever. And
Mhm.
I think that's where if we can talk about the hostility that comes from with the infighting and things back and forth and people online, this is why I'm so sensitive to the women and the people, the parents who've had issues with the AGP gate and people campaigning for AGP and the typology and everything so hard to the point where they're like, we need to teach about it in schools to like children. And I'm like, whoa. And then you get the hostility from the other side of that, the opposition to that. And it's like, I sympathize with them because they're having a visceral reaction to people who have hurt them and to something that has hurt them in their lives and things like that. Like this is the same type of person, I guess, that reminds them of people who've hurt them. So it's like hard to just drop that because they recognize the danger and they recognize the harm. And then when you talk to these other people that are pushing it, they're like, no, you're just pearl clutching and hysterical and you need to just forget it. And it's like, they can't, you know?
Yeah, well, you're in the same position I'm in, is that, nobody's happy with your position. So I completely disagree with this attempt to make autogynephilia into something that's just a normal variation on heterosexuality, this rebranding it as auto heterosexuality. I just like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I'm sorry, no. I reject
Yeah.
that utterly. And on the other hand, um, the fact that I work with men who have this issue and sympathize with them and try to understand them, it doesn't make the gender critical feminists very happy either.
Yeah.
They just want to denounce them all as porn addled fetishists. And what I try to do in this essay is to distinguish from people who are defending this idealized false self of them, version of themselves, which is, I say, a defense against shame, the trans rights activists who are out there saying trans women are women and we're going to destroy you if you don't agree. That's one type. And then there's the other type, who are the men I see in my practice and who aren't going out in public dressed as women, who are struggling with it and trying to understand what drives them. I have a lot of sympathy for them, not a lot of sympathy for the first type. And I understand why people like Kelly J. Keene get rabid about them. I mean, the way they are treated by these men is really appalling. I also I have very little patience with the idea of, it just being a normal sexuality, and that, Anne Lawrence at one point says that autogynephiles come to feel about their female identity the way a man who is married to a woman after a long time might feel about her, loving, idealizing, that, and it's just like, really? I'm sorry. No. I mean, there's a difference between having a relationship with a real person in which there's mutual interdependency and vulnerability, and having a relationship with yourself. I'm sorry. They're entirely different.
Yeah. And I used to have quite a few friends who were trans-identified males, and one of them did me the favor of showing me screenshots from their chat group. And when I wasn't around, the things that they said about women and each other and everything was totally different than things that they said when people, they were really horrendous to each other, tearing each other down. And they had basically harassed the youngest among them that I knew of into, with, oh, you're not attractive, and you don't pass, send nudes. And so he did. And they tore him to shreds. It was awful. Things that they said, I don't even want to repeat some of the memes they shared about, like, I will say it concerned having a sexual relationship with a biological woman, or a woman. Every woman is biological, but like a woman's boyfriend or husband, and then basically excreting his fluids and reading her texts and whatever. It was just awful. It was quite possibly some of the most disgusting things I've ever read that they were, and it was just, I couldn't believe, I immediately just started blocking most of them. I was like, I cannot, like, I can't trust you to be, like, honest with me or to be genuine. Like, what do you, it was so able-opening. And I've been very careful with them since then. I also, I just have been very, very careful with them. And I keep telling people, just watch out, because they will present a totally different version of themselves to you than they have, especially if they're living full-time as their identity.
Right.
Then they are presenting with each other or by themselves. Like, this idea that they are just married to themselves and have this really loving relationship is a fantasy, I think, most of the time.
The word I use in my essays, it's just preposterous. I mean, how could anybody believe that that's true? And I, as I've made clear, I have very little patience for it. The people who are defending their trans identities, believing that trans women are women, and going that route are dangerous. Because if you challenge it and they perceive you as a threat, they will come after you. They will hurt you.
Yeah.
That's different from somebody who acknowledges he has a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And it's really toxic and really a disservice to these men to play into it and yassify it, like encourage it and things like that. Like, I feel like there's a difference between telling somebody, like, a color looks nice on them or something, or that something is particularly flattering if you genuinely believe it, and going out of your way to be like, no, you look fabulous. So that, like, even if they don't. And it's like, just don't say anything. Like, you just treat them like a normal person. You don't have to baby them. And it's not helping. It's really not helping to baby them.
Or
So,
I would say lying to them. Lying to people never helped anyone, right?
Yeah. So it's, I find myself often in a difficult position because I am like I would say friends with Aaron Terrell and things like that. We've texted and we have each other's numbers and things like that. I disagree with the way that Aaron characterizes autogynephilia as just a normal variant of heterosexuality. I feel like maybe Aaron has said otherwise here and there, but I'm not quite sure recently. Last week kind of got into like a heated thing. We haven't really talked. Like, I'm very direct, and I can be a little like aggressive when I'm curious about something. I don't curse at anybody. I try, but it's hard to read intent, like, and tone from text.
Right.
But it's just, I'm very, especially like now that my hormones are back to normal, I'm very like intense with my questioning. I'm very, very curious and like rapid fire with my questions. And so just, I feel like we got into a spot where we were disagreeing about some things, and I'm not quite sure where Aaron's positions are now, but I had to stop and be like, you're suggesting that we teach about this very niche thing to children in high school, like teens in high school, as part of like sex ed, because you believe that there are so many boys that have this. And I don't think that's accurate.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's a worthy goal. They want to save boys from needlessly transitioning medically, right? If they don't understand that they're struggling with autogynephilia, great. I think that's a good idea, but I don't think we do that by teaching it as a normal sexuality in high school. No.
Yeah.
No.
So okay. Let's do a hypothetical. If a boy was presenting to you with, as you described it, it was looking like it was going that way. Like, what would your method be for approaching that with that patient?
Well, that's not hypothetical, because I do have boys like that in my practice. So the way I see it is that these are boys who have a lot of shame, they have really low self-esteem, and what I see them doing with their trans identification and their involvement sometimes with online groomers, let's say, is they're getting a lot of stroking. They're being made to feel about themselves that they're pretty, that they're attractive. They get rewarded, and it's like a drug to counter the shame they feel. And my goal is to try and find a way to help them feel good about themselves in other ways, like not necessarily by developing, quote, masculine self-esteem, but something that's based more on the reality of their abilities and their gifts and their accomplishments, to get them more comfortable with the idea of taking the initiative and goal setting and persevering towards achieving things, rather than retreating into this sort of passive space where they get admired for being pretty, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely does. And I think that happens to the girls as well. But it's so confusing for the boys, because I think it also makes them feel confused about their sexuality and things like that.
Right.
Like, they might suddenly feel like, well, am I gay because these are men that are making me feel this way? And then I'm kind of attracted to this idea of myself as a girl. And so it can really be confusing on this fundamental level when they're in that transition period from child to adult, and there's so much of that kind of going on already, that like awakening, if you will.
No, and especially now, I mean, especially at this moment, this cultural moment where there's all this dialogue about trans identities and there's all this dialogue about toxic masculinity and the patriarchy and rape culture. It's like, you know, boys, I've talked about this at Denver, like boys today are really uncomfortable with their sexuality. They don't quite know what to do with it. And, you know, so if they don't want to be an oppressor, right? They don't want to be one of the rapist class, then, you know, it's sort of an escape to be a trans-identified boy who's actually a female, right? You don't have to deal with all that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a simplified view, but it does play a part in pretty much everything I've seen.
Yeah. I've seen it. I mean, I've seen it. I've talked to them, and I've tried reaching people and talking to them on the other side of things. I do it less now because I'm more careful about who I get into comment sections with back and forth to save time. But yeah, it really does come back to that. Like, I am rewarded for this attention in a way that I was never rewarded in the past.
Right.
In the past, I was made to feel dirty and bad. And now I feel wonderful about myself, and I'll actually take selfies, and I feel positive, and I feel cute, and I feel wanted. And it's like, oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. You felt otherwise, like, in your life. I'm really sorry that people made you feel like you weren't all those things before.
Right.
And that this is not the way. I'm really sorry. The only people who are doing this for you are perverts, really.
And the other thing about that is that, and I talked about this in my paper on the revolt against authority for Colin, that I see these kids kind of avoiding adulthood and the need to move into a responsible position and to make difficult choices and to figure out what to do with their lives. They just retreat into this trans identity in which that's it. You don't need to do anything else. You know, you get rewarded and praised for being your brave trans self. Excuse me. And then you're done, right? There's nothing else.
Yeah. And this is one thing I do really agree with Aaron on, is Aaron was talking about, it's not even about medicalizing anymore. It's not even about transitioning to something. It's just being trans is what's becoming attractive now. Just slapping on those labels and the little flag emoji and you're good to go. And it's really an odd thing how many kids are just wanting to dissociate from anything, like a goal, a motivation, a hobby, a life. Like, they just want this label and it makes them special.
Right. You know, I think that Jonathan Haidt has something to say about this and the way in which this past generation of parents have coddled and sheltered their children from having to deal with adversity and challenge and frustration. They, you know, or the snowplow parents who kind of clear the way and make everything easy. I think it's a factor, you know, it's not the explanation, but it's a factor that these kids are kind of unprepared for the real world. They don't know how to deal with adversity and frustration and challenge and fear, and they take refuge in these trans identities that are celebrated, and then they don't need to do anything else. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
We're in a mess.
We are. What would you suggest as activities that parents could do with their boys and even their girls that could kind of start to pull them back to being more like in tune with their bodies and connect with their communities and their families?
It was interesting. There was a Twitter exchange last night with somebody talking about this issue of getting your kids physically active and taking hikes. And this one man said, don't ask your children what they want to do. Tell them what they're going to do. And that's our role as fathers, to lead our families. So I said to him, at the risk of inviting a dog pile, do you think that that is the role of fathers? I mean, do fathers have a role that's different from what mothers do? No response. Nobody touched it with a 10-foot pole. But I do think he's right, and it can be a mother or a father who does it. But you just say, we're going on a hike.
Yeah.
You know, you will put down your smartphone, won't be coming along. We're going for a hike. We're going camping. We're going to go play, pickleball. We're going to do whatever. But I think you can't invite them. You have to, you can't expect them to be amenable. You're going to have to force them. I don't know. I tell you, if I had my parental trauma to do all over again, I would have pulled my daughter out of school, taken her out, taken away her smartphone, and do what another parent I know did, is just go live somewhere else, live in another country, because you're fighting a huge battle when the whole culture, that's an exaggeration, but so much of the culture is against what you think is best for your kids.
Yeah, and the truth is, I mean, not to push religion on anybody, but just to use it as an example, we used to live in kind of little Christian communities, and like way back when, and everybody went to the same church and everybody knew each other, and they had little socials, like church socials and things like that. Now we don't, and we live in a more secular society, and we don't really have socials and things like that aren't happening at the school. Well, the problem is now that the school is pushing all this stuff on the students, where do we go? Just for them to have no messaging, like just the social without the messaging, just so they can talk to each other, just so they can be with each other and just interact and be like humans together without all these ads and flags and all that.
That's what I mean. It's like it's everywhere. And how do you have an influence when the world is against you? I mean, we're seeing this now, and you saw that case in Montana where supposedly they took away this 14-year-old child from her parents because they would not affirm her identity. I mean, wow.
Yeah, I'm actually helping out with that case. I just
Good for you.
Spoke with a Montana representative who works with children and families, and got them connected with the family through Gabrielle Clark. I'm part of her Affirming Reality Connected organization. So
great, fantastic.
Yeah, I'm doing what I can. I have an 8-month-old too, so like I'm trying to do like 50 different things and be a present parent to the 8-month-old.
Well, speaking of that, here's something I feel guilty about. So I'll like take the blame on myself, but I think it applies to a lot of parents. So I remember, my kids are grown now. The oldest is 32. And I remember when screens became available and how much, quote, easier parenting became, where all of a sudden you could just give them, this, I don't know what they were called then, tablets or whatever, handheld video games, and you wouldn't be worried about them screaming on the whole flight and bothering everybody else. I'm ashamed of that now. But I think a lot of us today, a lot of parents today, have handed over a lot of their responsibilities to screens. It's another thing that Heather talks about in the book, is that I think this expression, she says, don't let screens babysit your children.
Yeah.
And I think we got lazy or something. I don't know, but we didn't realize what we were getting into.
Well, we're humans, and humans are animals, and what animal doesn't just take the the load off when they can? Like we see it with chimps, we see it with any animal in captivity. If they can go ahead and just ignore something or just take a break for a little while, they're going to do it. So I don't think we should be that hard on ourselves. Like, yes, we should know better and we should be more present and responsible, but it is kind of, we've seen it in the natural world happen. So we're prone to it like any other creature. So,
Yeah, I agree. And I think that parents today need to be very cautious about screens
yeah,
and social
definitely.
media and internet. I mean, gosh, I don't know what I would do if I had kids growing up now. I don't think I would let them have any access to the internet or a smartphone until they were like 15 or 16.
Yeah.
But the
Well,
problem
it
is
was
that that makes them outsiders in their own peer group at
right.
school.
Yes.
So I don't
hmm
know what the answer is.
It was difficult because my parents were, my mother was an enabler and my father was very abusive. And I couldn't take my siblings out. So I just had to do the best that I could and parent from across the country and over the phone and try to do what I could. And so I couldn't control that my mother was allowing my brother, who was like 5 or 6 years old, to get online and play video games with
Yeah.
people, strangers. So all I could really do was just to the best of my ability constantly throw in like, be careful because some people, some strangers might trick you into thinking they're a kid and they're not a kid. It's a grown up who's pretending so that he can make you do things that might hurt you or say weird things to you or something that makes you uncomfortable. If that ever happens, let me know and tell me who they are and I will take care of it and go away from them. But just be very careful. And he's 6 years old, so he's like, okay. But eventually it did sink in. And it did actually happen to my sister where this girl she knew was actually a man pretending to be a girl. And she was pretty wise to that game and collected all the screenshots and everything, sent it to me. And we were able to send that to the authorities, thankfully.
Wow.
But yeah, it is scary, scary, scary that it's just open. You know, the stranger doesn't have to wait around the corner in the ice cream truck anymore. He can just be in your house talking to your kid in the next room. You have no idea. So definitely, definitely parents need to be there and be like, hey, this is weird, but let me just tell you that sometimes adults will be creeps. Be careful.
Well, and what, along the same lines, it's amazing to me that I think that progressive, open-minded parents are in favor of things like, drag queen story hour and in introducing the idea of these sexualities, in primary school, like trying to normalize all of these types of sexuality, or even if we're not going to normalize them, just even mentioning them at an age before they're ready to hear about them. And it's interesting that so many, it's progressives, parents are supporting these kinds of behaviors, entertainments, books in the library. I mean, I don't know.
I have to ask, because you've done work with these kinds of groups before and like studied them for your books, do you think it is that like they're trying to make up for having been bullied and having been outcast, and it is that vindictive narcissism coming back, like, well, now I'm going to, buck all of the stereotypes and buck all of the safeguarding and prove that these people are actually safe and people who don't fit in are fine and whatever.
We're talking about the parents and the progressive adults who support these
Yeah.
ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. I live in such a community in which I'm at odds with everybody, and I don't.
Yeah.
It's just a mystery. Like, how can you support these things? Sometimes I
Yeah.
think it's just, it falls into the culture wars. It gets divided on party lines, and thought stops at that point
It sure
because
does.
the Republicans, like that awful Ron DeSantis, are opposed to these kinds of things. Then they must be good, and I will stand up in
Yeah.
support of them. And that's the extent of it. thought stops. The idea that the other
Yeah.
side might actually have something useful to say.
Hmm.
No.
That's true. I was guilty of that before. But it was weird because I had grown up and I was friends with Republicans and I was a Democrat. And I was like, yay, we're all getting along and we're all American and we all have our differences, but ultimately we just want what's good for the country. But then over time, they just kept whispering in my ear with all these talk show hosts and everything that, ooh, those evil Republicans, don't talk to them. They're not actually your friends. They want to kill you and they want to kill everybody. And so eventually I did end up in that place. And it really wasn't until I saw how they were pushing this on kids that kind of like started it. And I was like, having grown up with those feelings, it's really not cool to start inciting them in children.
Yeah.
And then I saw how they were treating Tulsi Gabbard, and that kind of finished it for me. And I was like, what do you want? Like, she is a woman of color. She is not Christian. Or I don't think she was Christian. I think her husband they practice Hinduism, something like that. But yeah, like all of these things. And I was like, and she's a woman, like she's kind of what you want, right? They were like blocking her out over and over again. And I was like, okay, something else is going on here. They're not being honest with me.
The best book I've read on this subject one of the best books is Matt Taibbi's book, Hate Incorporated. And he talks about how the media landscape has fractured and that we no longer speak to the country as a whole, but we speak to particular constituencies, and that the way that the networks engage their constituencies and get them to be invested is by inciting hatred of an enemy on the other side. And he just talks about how all the messaging that comes through the media, and I think it's true on both sides, it's to foment hatred of the other party, which makes it impossible to have any kind of a, rapprochement between the two views, to find compromise, to find what you have in common. And I think people are now stuck in that way of thinking. Like, the idea of compromise is anathema to everybody, right?
Yeah, I agree. It's... I don't know how we fix it without just talking to each other. Like I said, even if I really disagree with somebody about something and it seems heated, the fact that we can talk about it at all is so great. And I love that. And I don't hold it against them. It's like, I don't think you're a bad person. I just think we disagree. And that's okay. Like, we can just keep talking about it. Like, even though I'm uncomfortable or, talking about certain things or whatever, because it's frustrating. Like, I think that's what it is. I think people are just not okay with being frustrated, maybe. But yeah, we're not going to get anywhere without like just kind of yelling at each other sometimes and disagreeing.
Or just dividing into our silos and having nothing to do.
Get over that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A friend of mine and I, Marla Estes, a couple of years ago, we taught an online course. We had about a couple dozen students, and it was called Cultivating Humility. Mm-hmm. And it was about teaching the mindset that you need in order to be able to engage with someone on the other side, which means being humble about the limits of your own knowledge and being honest about the ways in which you lie to yourself about what you actually know. And it was great. It was a really great course. And she's continuing to do that work. Braver Angels, another organization. There are these great organizations that are trying to help people to start talking to one another. And I used to want to do that work. And I feel like I've fallen back into the polarizing trap, because now I just want to defeat gender ideology. I just want it out of the institutions. I want it discredited and banished from everything. It's like there is no compromise. There has to be victory. So I don't know. Did I just fall back into the polarizing trap myself? I don't know. It's the way I feel.
There's that trap, of like how much nuance and how much understanding do we allow before it's that slippery slope again of like, well, we let you in, we let you talk and whatever, and we understand each other. And then they get that wedge in and they start again. So there are some things, I think, that it's okay to be like, no, like murder is wrong. Sterilizing kids
I
is
draw
wrong.
the line at murder.
Yeah, like, like pedophilia as a sexuality. No, that's still wrong. Like, like that kind of thing. And it's
Totally.
weird how some people will just be so nuanced. It's like, no, let's destigmatize the pedophilia. Let the pedophiles come and like hang out. And they can even hang out with my kids. It's fine. It's like, no, like, wait a minute. So
No, I mean, I like what you're saying. I think there's a value for stigmatizing. I think public shaming serves a social good when it upholds common values and protects innocent people. I don't think there's anything wrong with stigmatizing pedophilia. I don't think we should normalize that.
No, I think there's more danger in normalizing it. Like, it's the fox in the hen house. It's like, sure, we can let the fox into the hen house, and when he hurts somebody, then we'll stigmatize. It's like, why do you even want to risk him being in there? Like,
I know.
So, yeah, it's just too much nice. And it's like,
I think we're living in an era. It's been going on for a long time in which we've culturally tried to remove the shame from everything. That shame is just, it's a universally bad thing. Everybody agrees. John Bradshaw says toxic shame is bad, which it is. Brene Brown says that social shaming of women is bad, which it is. But somehow shame as a whole has gotten a bad name. And one of my points I like to argue is, well, if shame is such a bad thing, why, from an evolutionary perspective, did humans evolve the capacity to feel shame? If we are able to feel shame, it must serve some species good.
Right.
So there are evobiologists who will argue that the capacity to feel shame is helpful for creating tribal unity, in adherence to tribal values, discouraging freeloading and other traits that are not useful for the survival of the tribe and consequently of the individual, so that being sensitive to shame, which is really being excluded from the tribe, you're banished, you're deemed unacceptable, which means you'll probably die. Being sensitive to shame is a good thing. I agree that shame is a good thing. It can be a good thing. It can be a toxic thing, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Is that something that you cover in your book?
It's something that I cover in my 2018 book called Shame.
I should have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you can think of that we haven't covered with autogynephilia or anything like that?
I think we've pretty much covered it all. We hit the bases.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joe Burgo, for coming on and talking with me.
It was fun. It was a fun conversation. I think these podcasts are best when you just start talking to somebody you like and you have a good talk together.
Yeah. I loved getting to meet you. That was great. I'm really glad that we got to meet each other before talking this way, which I've never done with anybody that I've interviewed before. So that was great.
What do you mean? Is that not true? What do you mean?
I've never met somebody first in person that I've interviewed and then interviewed them this way.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. Everybody that I've talked to in any interview that I've been in, like whether I was the interviewee or the interviewer, I've only ever met them online first. And some I've never met in person, but I did get to meet Jennifer Lahl in person, so that was nice.
It's the great thing about those conferences like Heritage and GenSpect Denver is it's like, getting to meet these people. They're people I've known for years and never met, and then finally get to meet them in person. It's great. It's fantastic.
Yeah. So,
well, you, Zach, are doing great work. I appreciate it. I appreciate it being invited on.